At 7:10 p.m., on the 3rd of March 1989, Anja watched the scanner beep under fluorescent lights in Schöneberg. The dot matrix printer whined, then stuttered, as it punched a pale receipt into her hand. Her drawer had come up short yesterday, and the manager had made her count twice. So when the quiet man stepped forward with a small basket, she noticed everything. Bread, fish, cigarettes, nothing that should earn much, nothing that should matter. He slid a rewards card across the counter and asked, softly, "Put it on the card." The reader blinked red and died, forcing her into the manual entry screen the store hated. As she typed, his thumb covered the last digits. Not fully, just enough to turn the number into a guess. The receipt printed the full string anyway, and he watched the paper like it was a message. He paid in exact change, coin by coin, and ignored the roll of stamp vouchers beside the register. Then, as if remembering a rule, he asked for the points again. Anja tore the receipt on the serrated edge, and his eyes flicked to the tear, then back to her face. She handed it over. He glanced once, folded it, and set it down like trash he still wanted. When she slid his change across, he left the stamp vouchers untouched, but he waited until she confirmed the points line. After he walked out, the dot matrix whine kept echoing in her ears, and she felt the drawer get lighter. On the next transaction, the points were normal. On the next, they were normal again. Only his receipt looked wrong, too many points for too little food, as if the register had been told to lie. By closing, the supervisor's count confirmed what she feared. The till was short, and her name sat beside the figure. The manager called her into the back room, away from customers, away from cameras, and held up the folded receipt. "Why were you entering card numbers by hand?" he asked, already sounding certain she'd done something wrong. Anja opened her mouth to explain the dead reader, the covered digits, the exact coins, and realized none of it proved anything. In that moment, she understood the trap. A loyalty card had turned her register into a signal, and she would be the first person blamed when it was traced. Outside, someone lifted a payphone receiver across the street and set it back down without dialing. Anja didn't see who, but she heard the single ring, a punctuation mark at the end of his visit. Years later, investigators would circle this receipt in red ink because the typed digits were the first crack in a handler's cover. By the time Anja reached home, the folded receipt had softened in her pocket. She smoothed it on the kitchen table beside her pay envelope. The points line still looked wrong, but she told herself the register was old, and the new loyalty system was worse. In the store, worse was normal. The reader had arrived the previous year, a black box bolted under the counter by the cigarette rack. When it froze, the manager said to type the number and keep the line moving. If the customer complained, offer stamps instead. Stamps were the old program, a strip of paper, a glue pot, a booklet with squares. At the end of 10 squares, a housewife might get a free coffee or a discount on soap. Points were supposed to be cleaner. Anja had never met anyone who trusted them. Each cashier kept a blue ledger behind the till, filled with carbon copy sheets. At closing, you wrote your total, your voids, and any manual card entries. The manager signed with a blunt pencil and tore off the yellow copy. It was paperwork, not protection. Anja was trying to do a simple job and not lose money. When Anja mentioned the dead reader, the manager didn't look up from the ledger. He tapped the manual entry column with his pencil and told her not to make trouble. Shortages happened. Arguments lasted. On later shifts, the quiet man returned in the same narrow window, just before the rush thinned. Anja started skipping her cigarette break to watch the register clock. Time passed, and it cost her. He never took stamps, even when the clerk offered them to smooth over the dead reader. He waited for the points line, then left the vouchers behind like lint. Once, a child grabbed the strip and his hand closed over it too fast. When the reader worked, he still held the card so the last digits stayed hidden. Anja could have asked him to move his thumb, but she heard the manager's pencil tapping in her head. Not to make trouble, the store had reasons for every flaw. The freezer hummed too hot because the repairman never came. The lights flickered because the landlord owned the wires. The loyalty system miscounted because it was new. Anja tried to fit the quiet man into the same category. On nights when the drawer was short, the manager hovered over the ledger longer. He circled the manual entry column, then told Anja to leave it blank if the reader had been acting up. That way, he said, the office wouldn't bother them. The chain had started tracking points across branches, and head office liked clean numbers. Manual entries looked like mistakes, and mistakes triggered inspections. Inspections meant overtime, questions, and someone to blame. Anja wanted to keep her head down and keep scanning groceries. Stamps were anonymous. You could trade booklets in the stairwell. Points were tracked, tallied, and printed at the bottom of every receipt. If you wanted secrecy, stamps were easier. So why did he insist on points? At the end of one shift, the supervisor slid a form across the counter. It stated the shortage and the amount to be deducted from her next wages. There was a line for her signature. Signing made it ordinary. Refusing made it an accusation. Anja signed. She did it with the receipt still in her apron pocket. The paper edge scratched her thumb when she moved. Other cashiers noticed him, but only as a nuisance. He waited until the lane was nearly empty, then asked for the card number to be entered. If the reader worked, he claimed it hadn't scanned. If it failed, he watched the keys. Anja kept a laminated cheat sheet under the register, smudged by fingerprints. It listed the function keys for manual entry and the steps to cancel a wrong digit. She hated using it because it slowed the line and made her look careless. All she could do was ring up groceries and hope the drawer balanced. At home, she began saving the torn receipts in a jar meant for spare coins. She told herself it was for budgeting. It was also a way to prove she wasn't inventing the problem. One night, after the last customer, she stayed behind while the others locked the doors. She asked to see the blue ledger again, just to confirm her own entries. The manager flipped pages quickly and kept his hand over the manual entry column. He told her the office would handle it. Anja nodded and folded another receipt into her pocket for later. What else was he hiding? For the next week, Anja worked as if nothing had changed. She scanned, bagged, counted, and signed the shortage forms. The deductions became routine. So did her silence. Her jar of saved receipts filled anyway. Every strip smelled faintly of warm paper and cigarettes. She kept the one with the high points line on top. Most evenings, the dot matrix printer coughed at closing and fed out the Z report. It came on thicker stock, perforated, with totals no customer ever saw. Sales, voids, refunds, no sale openings, and, in a separate block, the loyalty tally. The manager usually tore it off and folded it into his jacket. That was policy, he said. He said head office wanted the originals. One night he left it on the counter while he took a phone call in the back. The paper sat under the fluorescent hum like a dare. Anja glanced at the door, then at the report. She slid it halfway under the cash drawer, just enough to read. The loyalty section showed a count of manual card entries. It was higher than the ledger. Next to it was a points total that didn't match what her receipts suggested. Not by a little. She copied the figures onto the back of a cigarette carton. When the manager returned, she pushed the Z report back into place. Her face stayed still. The printer's whine faded, but her ears kept it. She was still paying for the missing cash. The next afternoon, the quiet man came in during the same thin window before the rush. Bread again, fish again, a cheap bottle of mineral water. He asked for points, not stamps. The reader worked, but he still held the card, so her view ended early. Anja typed nothing this time. She let the scanner take the number and watched the receipt print. The points line climbed too high again. The man paid in exact coins and left without the stamp vouchers. After he left, Anja checked the drawer with her fingertip, counting bills by feel. She didn't take any. She didn't even hit the no-sale key. Still, by closing, the count would be short. A coworker named Rolf saw her staring at the ledger and asked what she was doing. Anja told him she was trying to stop paying for other people's mistakes. He nodded once and kept his voice low. He said the manager had been using his override key more than usual. Rolf had worked stores before the chain bought them. He knew what the override key sounded like when it turned. A quick beep, a longer dot matrix grind, then a new line on the tape. Refund, void, price correction. The shortage followed the override key, not her hands. Anja asked if Rolf had ever seen the manager do it while someone else was logged in. Rolf looked away and said he had, more than once, always near closing, always when the lane was quiet. The next time the manager called Anja into the back room, a man she didn't recognize was waiting. Plain coat, thin briefcase, hair cut short enough to look like a rule. He did not introduce himself to Anja as a customer. He asked for her name and her cashier number, and he wrote them down. The manager stood behind him, arms crossed. The stranger said there was an irregularity in the loyalty totals across several branches. He asked how often the reader failed. He asked who handled the Z reports. He asked whether Anja ever entered numbers by hand without recording them. Anja was the name on the shortages, not him. Anja answered carefully. She described the dead reader. The thumb over the digits. The exact change. She did not say the word KGB. She did not say anything about payphones. She talked like an employee trying to keep a job. The man asked for examples. Anja went quiet and reached for her apron pocket. The folded receipt was there, soft at the creases. She placed it on the table like a confession that hadn't been written by her. The manager's pencil hovered above the ledger. He didn't touch the receipt. The stranger read the loyalty number, then the points line. He asked whether this customer returned often. Anja said yes. She said the customer came in during the same narrow window most days. She stopped herself from adding anything else. Silence was still safer than a claim she couldn't prove. The stranger asked where the man went after leaving the store. Anja said she didn't know. That was true, and it was also a choice. When the meeting ended, the manager told her she was being written up for incomplete logs. It wasn't a firing. It was a mark. Her next schedule lost 2 evening shifts. At home, she opened her pay envelope and saw the smaller number. Rent stayed the same. She tore another receipt on its serrated edge and dropped it into the jar. In the blue ledger, someone had begun erasing the manual entry column. Who was protecting whom? The stranger came back a few days later, but not alone. They met Anja in a small office above the loading bay, where the air always smelled like cardboard and detergent. A wall map of West Berlin hung crooked over a metal desk. Someone had pushed pins into it. Red, blue. The stranger opened his thin briefcase and laid out paper in neat stacks. Receipts, ledger pages, a printout with columns Anja didn't recognize. He didn't call it an investigation. He called it a review. Anja sat with her hands on her knees, trying not to fidget. She was still the cashier whose drawer came up short. One of the men pointed at the map. The pins clustered in places Anja knew by the U-Bahn lines, not by names. Schöneberg, Kreuzberg, then farther north. He traced a finger along the routes between them, slow and deliberate. Not a timeline, a shape. The stranger asked if she remembered the quiet man's coat, his shoes, whether he carried a bag. Anja gave what she could. She left out what she couldn't prove. Then he slid a receipt across the desk. It wasn't hers, but the tear at the top edge looked familiar. The same jagged bite from a serrated bar. It made her think of her own fingers. The little ritual she did 100 times a night without noticing. Same card, the stranger said. He didn't read out the whole number. He tapped the last digits only, as if the first part didn't matter. Anja's throat tightened. Another receipt joined it. Another store. Same last digits. Same 2 high points line. Now it wasn't a weird customer. It was a rule. One of the men flipped open a notebook and drew 3 boxes. He labeled them with branch locations, then drew arrows between them. Under each box he wrote the same narrow window. Late afternoon into evening, when the rush thinned and the managers drifted close to the tills, Anja stared at the arrows like they were accusing her personally. She had been paying for this pattern without knowing it existed. The stranger asked about stamps again. Why would someone ignore free vouchers? Anja shrugged, because shrugging was safer than guessing. This time, the stranger answered his own question. He tapped the points line on the receipts. He isn't collecting points, he said. He's making them appear. It landed wrong at first, like a sentence missing a word. But then, Anja pictured the quiet man watching the paper feed, waiting for the printer to finish. She pictured the thumb hiding digits and the exact coins counted out like a habit. He needed the points printed. He needed them recorded. Stamps were for shoppers. Points were for someone who wanted proof that something had happened. The stranger leaned back and let the silence sit there, heavy and unpaid. Anja didn't speak. She had learned that talking made new problems. One of the men showed her a ledger page from another branch. Manual entry column, then a faint smear where someone had rubbed pencil marks away. The manager's pencil had done the same thing at her store. Anja swallowed and kept her face still. If she said that out loud, it would stop being a store issue. It would become a human accusation, with a human price. The stranger asked about her Z report. Who took it? Where it went? Anja said the manager took it to the office. That was true. She did not say she had read one once. She did not say she had copied totals onto a cigarette carton. She kept that part in her pocket with the receipts. Silence. Again. They moved to the printout with the unfamiliar columns. The stranger pointed to a line, and then another, a few days apart, different branches. Each line had the same loyalty identifier. Each line had a small basket value. Each line had a points credit that made no sense. He didn't explain the system in detail. He didn't have to. Anja could feel the logic the way you feel a draft through a cracked window. Something was being added on purpose. Then the man beside him did something that made Anja's stomach go cold. He picked up a pencil and circled a column on the printout. Shortage amounts. Not huge. Not dramatic. Enough to be dismissed as cashier error. Enough to be quietly deducted from wages week after week, in store after store. Anja's situation wasn't unique. That was worse, because it meant someone had learned how to steal without looking like a thief. The stranger asked Anja to tell them the quiet man's routine, not the man himself. Which lane he chose, whether he waited for a gap, whether he spoke to anyone else. Anja described the narrow window and the way he watched the receipt. She described the coins. She described the thumb. Then she stopped. The men didn't press her for feelings. They didn't ask how it was to lose money this way. They asked what she could remember. It was a different kind of pressure. Before she left, the stranger pointed to a single pin on the map with a circle drawn around it. A payphone location, marked by the corner of a street, not far from her store. He didn't claim the payphone proved anything by itself. He said it was a place that kept appearing near the pattern. Anja thought of the one ring she'd heard on the night she was first called into the back room. She didn't say that either. Instead, she nodded and took her coat. On the shop floor, life kept moving like nothing was happening. Mothers with lists, old men buying one apple, a child crying at the candy rack. Anja was still scanning groceries, but now she watched the entrance the way you watch a door you can't lock. A week later, after enough repetitions that even her manager couldn't call it coincidence, the stranger left a message with the supervisor. If the quiet man appeared again, Anja should note the time window and which direction he walked when he left. Not exact time, just the shape of it. The instruction was simple. It still felt like a trap. Anja tried to follow it anyway. She kept a scrap of receipt paper tucked under the register, ready to scribble. She didn't tell anyone else. At home, she began counting her coins before groceries, not after. Rent day didn't move just because she had a mystery. Then the store introduced its own break moment. One morning, Anja arrived for her shift and found her name crossed out on the schedule with a thick marker line. The supervisor avoided her eyes. He said the manager wanted to see her upstairs. In the office, the manager didn't offer a chair. He held up the blue ledger and flipped it open to the manual entry column. Blank lines. Missing notes. "You're not logging properly," he said. Anja started to explain the reader failures, the rushed line, the way he'd told her not to make trouble, but that sentence would be her word against his, and she could already see which word the company would believe. The manager slid a paper across the desk. "Suspension. Pending audit. Return your till key. Do not speak to other staff about internal matters." It read like punishment, dressed as procedure. Anja signed, because refusing would look like guilt. She handed over her key because there was no way to keep it. On the way out, she passed the register lanes and heard the dot matrix printers whining in their cages. She didn't belong to any of them now. Outside, she stood on the sidewalk with her hands empty and felt how fast routine can be revoked. She had been a small part of a pattern she didn't choose, and now she was being removed from the board. The stranger's message was still in her head. Note the window. Note the direction. But she wasn't scheduled to be there to see anything. That night, She opened her jar of receipts and picked the newest strip off the top. The serrated tear caught on her thumbnail. She couldn't decide whether to keep quiet or force the story into the open, and the next step would require her to choose. Suspension turned the week into arithmetic. Rent, groceries, the bus ticket. Anja stopped buying cigarettes and started buying cheaper bread. The review men did not send letters. They used a payphone and a short message with her supervisor. "Meet us. Bring what you saved." Anja walked to the address. They gave her an office above a repair shop, the kind with a buzzer that didn't list names. Inside, the same thin briefcase opened again. This time, they didn't show her a map first. They showed her money, a stack of refund slips from her branch, a second stack from other branches. Most were small, most were timed near closing, or during that narrow window before the evening rush faded. They didn't accuse her manager out loud. They didn't need to. On each slip was the same thing. An override code that never belonged to Anja, used while her cashier number was still active. Someone had been reaching into her shift like it was a pocket. Then they put down something Anja hadn't expected. A loyalty card application card from the chain's office. A name, an address, a signature line. The name didn't match the quiet man's face. The address, when read aloud, didn't sound like a place a person lived. It sounded like a building you passed without noticing. "That account should not be active," one of them said, careful with verbs. "It's being used anyway." Anja understood the simple version. The card wasn't just his. It was a costume, and now they wanted her to help pull it off. A grounding truth sat in the middle of the room. Anja was a cashier without a schedule, and the people with clean coats were asking her to step back into the lane that had cost her wages. They offered a choice that wasn't really a choice. If she stayed suspended, she stayed blamed. If she cooperated, she might get her shifts back at least long enough to prove what the paper already suggested. On a Thursday afternoon, she went back to the store with a temporary badge and a single instruction. Do not confront him. Do not chase him. Do not improvise. Just make the points print. Just make the number complete. They had arranged a repair on her lane's card reader. A technician showed up, unscrewed the panel, and left it unstable. It would fail at the right moment. Anja understood what that meant. Controlled failure. Controlled paper. Her manager watched the whole thing with his arms folded. He didn't ask why head office cared about one reader on one lane. He asked Anja whether she had been talking. Anja said no. It was the safer answer, and she used it like a key. He handed her the blue ledger and tapped the manual entry column. "No blanks," he said, "and no stories." She nodded, because nodding kept the job in motion. Then she did something she hadn't done before. She memorized where the ledger sat. She memorized where he kept the override key. She memorized the sound his shoes made when he stepped behind the counter. The shift moved like it always did: milk, onions, bread, until the clock slid into the familiar window. The quiet man came in with the same neat coat, small basket, exact posture. He chose Anja's lane. When he set down his items, his eyes went to the card reader first, not her face. He pushed the rewards card forward and covered the last digits with his thumb. Anja scanned his groceries and waited for the moment the line would thin. Then she lifted the card toward the reader. The red light blinked and died. Manual entry screen. Her fingers hovered over the keys. The plan was simple. Type, print, keep the journal copy of the receipt tape, and let the watchers do the walking outside. No heroics. But the quiet man leaned closer, just enough to block the view of the keypad from anyone behind him. His thumb pressed down harder. Anja made a small, ordinary mistake on purpose. She entered one digit wrong and let the register beep. She hit cancel. Slow and visible. A second chance. He adjusted his thumb without thinking, the way people adjust when they believe they're correcting someone else's error. For half a second, the last digits were exposed. Anja typed them. The dot matrix printer whined and spit out the receipt with the full number printed cleanly. The points line climbed. Absurd and specific. The man watched the paper feed like a countdown. He paid in exact coins. He left the stamp vouchers untouched. And then he did the one thing that didn't fit his careful routine. He looked past Anja, over her shoulder, toward the manager's position behind the cigarette rack. Anya didn't turn. She tore the journal strip from the internal roll and slid it into the ledger like it belonged there. Her hands kept moving as if nothing had happened. The quiet man took his customer copy and paused at the exit. Not long enough to be dramatic, just long enough to see who was standing where. When he left, Anja kept scanning. That was the rule. If she stopped, she became the story. At closing, the manager counted the till without speaking. He wrote a number, then held his pencil above her signature line. "You want your shifts back," he said. It wasn't a question. Anja signed. She signed because Rent didn't care about principles, and because she needed to stay close long enough for the paper to matter. Outside, across the street, a payphone receiver lifted and dropped back into place. No dialing, just the sound of a decision being sent. Anja walked home with her apron folded under her arm, hearing the dot matrix whine in her head like a warning tone. If the quiet man had noticed the trap, he wouldn't come back the same way. So, what would he do next? The quiet man didn't come back the next day. He skipped the window Anja had learned like a second clock. He skipped it again the day after that. The review men called it what it was. Finally, when they thought she couldn't overhear, a reaction. "He thinks someone saw," one of them said. Not angry, not triumphant, just matter of fact, like weather. They told Anja not to return to the lane. Not this time. If he was adjusting, they wanted him to believe she was gone. So she stayed home, suspended on paper, invisible in real life. And that was how she learned the worst part of an operation. The moment your help becomes unnecessary, you become a liability again. Across the street from her branch, 2 men sat in a parked car with newspapers folded open like props. At the payphone, another man stood with a cigarette he never lit. They were there because of the thing Anja had placed on a backroom table. A receipt with a complete loyalty number. A number isn't a name, but it's a handle. And once you have a handle, you can start pulling. The chain's head office confirmed what the application card suggested. The account existed, but the address was a dead end. An office suite that rented mailboxes by the month. No real tenant, no real signature. The account had also been used in 4 branches that made no sense for a regular shopper. Not close to one home, not close to one job, close to transit lines, close to exits, close to places where a person could vanish into crowds. That was the map they'd shown her upstairs. Now it became a schedule. On the 3rd evening, the quiet man finally appeared again, just not in Schöneberg. He walked into a branch in Kreuzberg at 6:40, bought almost nothing, and asked for points with the same soft insistence. He held the card the same way. He paid with the same exact coins. The cashier there didn't know Anja, but she had been briefed to do one thing. When the reader failed, type the number, print the receipt, save the journal strip. The receipt tore on the serrated edge. The dot matrix printer whined. The points line printed too high for too little food. And then the quiet man did something different. He didn't leave toward the U-Bahn the way he usually did. He walked the long way, past a bakery and a closed kiosk, to a payphone that sat under a street lamp like an afterthought. He lifted the receiver. He held it to his ear. He waited just long enough for a single ring to sound somewhere else, somewhere unseen. Then he set the receiver down and walked on. No dialing, no record, just a signal sent in the simplest language. "I'm here." 2 blocks later, he stopped at a pedestrian crossing and waited as if he had nowhere to be. When the light changed, he crossed with a small group. He blended the way practiced people blend, not by hiding, but by being perfectly ordinary. At the next corner, a second man approached from the opposite direction. Older, better dressed. A briefcase held close, like it was heavy with paperwork. They didn't shake hands. They didn't look at each other long. The quiet man slowed. The older man adjusted his grip on the briefcase. For 1 second, their bodies overlapped in the crowd. Then they separated. The exchange was small enough that Anja would never have noticed it from behind a register. But the men watching saw the thing that mattered. The quiet man's left hand came away with a thin envelope, the kind stores used for bank deposits. A deposit envelope. A perfect disguise. The older man continued on without turning his head. The watchers didn't rush in. Not yet. They followed. The older man walked to a parked car with diplomatic plates and opened the passenger door with a key that looked too new to be a spare. He sat, placed the briefcase on his lap, and drove toward a checkpoint. That, too, was a kind of answer. In a world of paperwork and borders, diplomatic plates were a shield, and shields usually belonged to someone who expected trouble. By the time he reached the crossing, 2 different teams had converged. The men from the car, the man by the payphone, and another pair who hadn't been visible at all. They didn't block the vehicle dramatically. They didn't drag him out. They waited until the car was stopped for routine checks, then approached with the calm of people who had already decided how far they were allowed to go. The older man showed credentials. He used a name that matched his papers, but names weren't the point anymore. He was photographed, quietly, cleanly, and later, in a different office, those photographs would be compared against other photographs taken in other contexts, embassy receptions, cultural events, a face caught at the edge of a crowd, a pattern of presence, a man with diplomatic cover who moved like a handler, careful, repetitive, never the one holding the real secrets, always the one touching the people who did. The quiet man, Anja's quiet man, was picked up an hour later as he tried to board a train, not arrested in a public scene. Contained, questioned, released. Released because the wrong kind of arrest could become an international problem. But released didn't mean unknown anymore. It meant exposed. When the review men finally sat across from Anja again, they spoke in the clipped language of outcomes. They told her the older man would be declared unwanted. They didn't use the phrase persona non grata, but it hung in the room anyway. They told her the quiet man wasn't a shopper at all. He was a courier of small signals. A man who used loyalty points the way others used, coded phrases, proof on paper that a message had been delivered, that a meeting had been kept. Then they turned the story back toward the store, because handlers rarely build their own ladders. The manager was brought in last, not to the police station, to head office, to a conference room that smelled like stale coffee and polished wood. They put the Z reports in front of him. They put the refund slips beside them. They showed him how his override key appeared like fingerprints across shortages assigned to cashiers. He denied it once. Then they slid the simplest thing across the table, a journal strip from Anja's lane, torn on the serrated edge, showing the same loyalty number and the same absurd points credit. His pencil stopped moving. He admitted enough to save himself from the worst version of the story. He said he'd been paid to help a customer. He said the loyalty system was easy to manipulate if you knew which function keys to press. He said he thought it was a scam for free groceries, not politics. They didn't correct him. They didn't need him to understand the motive. They needed him to confirm the mechanism. And that closed the question that had been bleeding Anja dry. Someone inside the store had been helping. The next day, Anja received her letter. Termination, policy violations, incomplete logs, failure to follow procedure, no mention of the operation, no mention of the receipts, no apology for the wages she'd lost. The company didn't want a story that suggested its new loyalty system could be turned into a communications tool. It didn't want headlines. It wanted silence, and silence was the one thing Anja had been good at. She sat at her kitchen table with the jar of receipts and chose one strip from the top, another serrated tier, another pale line of ink. She held it between 2 fingers until it warmed. They had exposed a handler. But what happened to the people who noticed first? What happened to the ones who paid while everyone else built a case? Anja did not go back to the store. They replaced her before the week was over. She saw the new cashier once through the window smiling, quick, young enough not to know what could go wrong. Her own jar of receipts stayed on the table like an unpaid debt. She thought about throwing them out. She didn't. The news that filtered through the radio said nothing about loyalty cards or shortages. It said a diplomatic reassignment had occurred, a line or two about a minor scandal, phrased as information irregularities. No mention of a grocery or a handler or a woman who noticed digits under a thumb. Berlin was already changing. You could feel it in the streets, in the way people talked about the wall, like it might actually fall someday. Anja didn't think about walls. She thought about ledgers. Rolf found her once in the market and said the manager had resigned. He said the store got new readers, smaller ones that didn't jam. He said head office called it a modernization. Then he said something that stayed with her. They'll keep the points program. Just fix the numbers. She nodded, unsure whether that counted as justice. Sometimes, on her walks, she passed the payphone across from the store. The receiver still hung at an odd angle, as if it remembered being lifted mid-ring. She wondered whether anyone else still heard that single sound, the tone that wasn't a call, just a signal. The men from the review never came back. They didn't need her version anymore. They had the receipts, the tapes, the map. Her usefulness had been converted to evidence, then filed away. She found other work, a bakery, a different register, fewer forms to sign. There, the printer was quiet, almost polite. No dot matrix scream, no serrated tear. Sometimes she missed the noise. Late at night, she would empty her apron and find crumbs instead of paper. She would count them out of habit, like coins. One evening, she reached into the jar, picked out the first receipt, the one from the 3rd of March 1989, and flattened it under the light. The ink had faded to a pale gray, but the points line was still visible. Too high for bread and fish. Still wrong. Still hers. She folded it once and slid it into her coat pocket. It didn't fit with her new life, but it belonged to the only version of herself that had ever mattered. When the wall came down months later, people cheered and threw bricks into the air like confetti. Anja stood in the crowd and clapped, though she wasn't sure what she was celebrating. Freedom, yes, but for whom? No one ever told her whether the quiet man had been tried, traded, or simply disappeared. In some stories, he had another name. In others, he never existed at all. That was how these things ended. The paper stayed, the people didn't. She imagined him somewhere on a train, carrying a new card, waiting for another register to fail, another cashier to type what wasn't meant to be seen, another trail to begin the same way hers had ended. The receipt in her pocket felt heavier than its weight. She left it there when she washed the coat, and the ink bled into the lining. The words vanished, but the stain remained. At the bakery, she still tore paper at the counter edge, a habit her hands refused to forget. Each tear sounded like the old printer whining behind her. Each tear reminded her that systems remember people only as long as the paper lasts. Anja never redeemed a single point. She never used another rewards card, but she kept one thing: the rhythm of the machine, the way silence can turn into evidence if someone is patient enough to listen. Because the truth of it, the quiet kind of truth, is that the smallest transaction can open the biggest door. A loaf of bread, a folded receipt, a number typed by hand. That was all it took to make a handler visible.